Hello, Bobby Torres of Frightbox recording here to dive deep and dissect an old mix of mine from way back in 2010 that wasn't that great, and more importantly, what I would do differently today. Now you might remember a few months ago, if you follow this channel, I released a video where I did the same thing, but with a mix from way back in 2007. Now, I've had a lot of people reach out and ask me to do a video on how I would go about remixing that song from 2007 in order to make it better, more presentable, and just more professional sounding. And here's the thing, that mix had inherent issues with the source files. A lot of the performances weren't that great. Back then I didn't do any pre-production. The drums weren't mic'd correctly. It just wasn't a great production from the very start. So the truth is, there isn't much I can do in the mix to make it presentable. I'd be polishing something that just wasn't solid in the first place. Now, because people kept asking me this, it got me thinking. It got me thinking back to, my earlier part of my career, and I wondered to myself, at which point did I start tracking things properly to where I would be able to produce a professional result today, if need be? If I had to go back and remix something, at what point did I kind of make that transition, like I said, to where I was capturing things properly at the source, even though my mixing might not have been caught up to where my tracking was at? And this led me back to the year 2009, and more specifically, really around 2010 is when I really started tracking things properly in the first place. So what we have here is a mix, in my opinion, that I tracked properly. I just didn't, nail the mix as well as I should have. Now, to give you some history and some context of this specific mix, this was done in 2010. Now, if you're a metal fan, you might remember around 2010, deathcore was all the rage. And it was also the beginning of the gent phase within metal. And at that time, every single band that came into my studio wanted that, that deathcore type of sound. Tons of drum samples, a ton of quantizing. They pretty much wanted live drums to sound like programmed drums. I know this might sound ridiculous, but at that time, it was kind of a fresh sound, and people, especially younger metal fans, really wanted that style of production. Now, the track here is more of a hard rock / metal style track, and I remember thinking to myself when I started it, I kind of wanted to get away from the deathcore sound. I didn't want to go crazy with drum samples. I wanted to kind of get back to manufacturing something that sounded like a live band, both in the production and the mix. I still wanted it to sound crisp, clear, and polished and modern, but with a slightly natural vibe around it. And also the singer was really going for a Glassjaw kind of thing. If you remember, in the early 2000s, there was a band called Glassjaw produced by Ross Robinson, and the singer wanted me to go for that style of production, particularly with his vocals. Now, listening to the track, which we're gonna play soon in a second, I gotta say, I kind of failed in both departments. I tried desperately to produce a mix that had a natural ambience, natural vibe, while still sounding polished, and to me, it just doesn't sound good. Not terrible, again, because it was tracked well, but just not a compelling sounding mix. I wanted it to sound analog, but to me, it doesn't sound analog at all, and the vocals, in my opinion, they have a cool vibe. The vocal performance was excellent, but I didn't nail the tone that the vocalist wanted. And we'll talk more about that when we go into the individual tracks. Let's go back and take a listen to this mix. And then I'm gonna dive deep, look at some of my processing, and explain to you what I would maybe do differently today. Let's check it out. Okay, so as you can hear, it's not the most terrible thing in the world. You could hear everything in a nice clear manner. Luckily the song was arranged in such a way where the arrangement was right at the source. And also, if you look here, I was pretty organized. This is when I really kind of started taking myself seriously in the studio and making sure that pre-production was in place. All the tempos were mapped before we set up a single microphone. I also finally got over the whole thing with miking cymbals correctly and realized it wasn't my preamps and it wasn't my converters. I just didn't know what I was doing as far as miking cymbals. So at this time I started miking cymbals in such a way where I would spot mic them so I would avoid the annoying hi-hat. If you look here, I spot mic'd the China, which is good for this style of music. Same thing with the ride cymbal, hi-hat, got a couple of room mics going on the drums. The other important thing here that's gonna enable me to remix this track is that I was smart enough back then, thank God, to have recorded DI tracks with the guitars, because in my opinion, this guitar tone is not good at all. Probably next to unusable if I really wanted to remix this song. But luckily, because I recorded DI tracks with the song, I can use a completely different guitar tone if need be when I remix this. Back in that last video where I showed you a mix from 2007, I didn't record any DIs. I also didn't edit anything. But either way, because I didn't record DIs, I couldn't reamp the guitars and the guitar tone was not that great and it was just a mess in general. Luckily, at this stage, around 2009, 2010, I finally smartened up, learned through experience and through my internship what I should be doing by capturing things properly within the production stage and just recording in general before I even got to the mix. And like I said, just overall, this is much more organized. As you can see, I have all my drums here. Then I got some lead guitars. It's a little disorganized. I mean, my bass should be next. I have my overdub guitars, my rhythm guitars, my bass, and my vocal tracks, and my send effects. So another positive is I didn't record a ton of tracks that just didn't need to be there, which is something that most people, myself included back in the day, just tend to do. Just record too many meaningless tracks that just end up clogging up the production. Now, like I said earlier in this video, my goal with this production was to produce a nice organic analog warm mix that had kind of like a modern edge to it, but just didn't sound, in the box and digital. And in my opinion, didn't do a great job. The drums sound really harsh and I hear this annoying high frequency on the snare drum. The guitars don't sound that great. The bass is okay. And the vocals are cool, they have a great vibe, but I didn't produce that analog color that the singer really wanted me to. And fun fact, I spent $1,000, maybe even more, before we tracked this song on a Universal Audio Solo 610 tube microphone preamplifier. When the singer mentioned this to me, I went out and bought this preamp thinking it would automatically give me a more analog tone for vocals, and it didn't. Not to say the preamp didn't sound great, it totally sounded awesome, don't get me wrong, but it didn't make as big of a difference as I thought it would. Again, a great sounding preamp, but I could have gotten something very similar out of just the stock preamps in my interface at the time. And if you've watched this channel for any length of time, you know by now that I just now, these days, use the preamps in my interface because that's all you really need. I achieve an analog sound in my DAW, which you will be learning more about next week when I break down my remix of this song. So let's start out with the drums here. I'm gonna solo my drums and let's take a listen to what they sound like in solo. Okay, so not a bad drum sound. Again, it's just a little too harsh to my ears, and there's a number of reasons for that. Let's take a look at the track count. I'm using a kick sample. Now this sample was of the actual kick drum itself. It was not of a pre-made sample taken from a sample library. I recorded drum samples of the drummer's kit on the day that we recorded drums. I then turned them into multi-velocity round robin samples that I re-triggered the natural kick drum with. Now I also have the natural kick drum here, the live one, and I'm not using it in the mix at all. I also have a snare sample, which is again, a sample of the actual snare drum from the kit that I'm blending in with the live snare of the kit. And I have both of them bussed, which is something I don't do anymore, to a snare submix. So the snare top sample are both being bussed to this snare submix. I then have a snare bottom track, rack tom 1, rack tom 2, overhead left, overhead right, a ride mic, China mic, hi-hat, and a room left and a room right track. So this song versus that song I mentioned, earlier in the video. By the way, if you want to check out the video where I talk about a mix that I did back in 2007, I'll leave a link below to that video in this video's description. Now, in that video, I showed you the drum tracks and they were a complete disaster at the source. That's not the case here. I definitely tracked the drums properly, which gives me hope that I'll be able to turn this mix into something, palatable today with the skills I have now. So those are the drum tracks that I have here. Like I said, it's not a terrible drum sound, but to me, it doesn't sound analog at all. It sounds a little over-processed. The snare is just way too pokey. It just doesn't sound like a natural drum sound to me, even though it's mainly natural drums. Pretty ironic. So let's look at the processing I have on the kick drum. Very simple. I'm only using a kick sample, so I don't need a gate. And I've got, if you look at this EQ, I'm sucking out every last bit of mid-range out of that kick drum. Let's take a listen to the kick drum in solo. And this is why the kick drum sounds like a basketball. Yeah, I'm just sucking out way too much mid-range, and I'm even using a notch filter, it looks like. So the stock Pro Tools EQ has this thing called a notch filter. So I'm not only reducing mid-range, I'm just completely eliminating all frequencies around 278 Hertz. This is a newbie mistake because, again, it makes the kick drum sound awesome in solo, but as you can hear within the context of the mix, the kick drum just sounds very unnatural, very cold, and just like a bunch of clicky, high frequency crap. And aside from that, I have some, it looks like some subtle compression. Nothing crazy there. Yeah, so my number one thing I would change here is I would just not EQ my kick drum to death. Let's take a look now at the EQ I have on my snare sample. Again, just way too much notching. I'm sucking out a ton of 1K, a ton of 660 Hertz, and it looks like a bunch of 1.67K. Nothing wrong with that, but to me this looks a little extreme. I would rarely do this today unless the snare drum really had a lot of ring to it. And again, if it did, I would have just made sure I muffle it right on recording day. Which I'm sure I did here, so I think this was me just using an arbitrary snare drum preset that I had saved. I seem to remember having this in my tracking template back then, which I don't anymore. Okay, on the snare sample, I am slamming it with compression, and I'm even using a ratio of 100:1, which is pretty much just a very high ratio limiter. I'd be much more subtle about it today. And let's look at the EQ on my live snare. Let's actually take a listen to the live snare. Yeah, if you look here, the output is actually clipping from the compressor, and that's because I have the gain cranked. I have the threshold set very low, -40, and I'm cranking the gain for some reason. Why, I couldn't tell you. Again, with that really high ratio, I'm just really slamming the snare drum, which there's nothing really wrong with that. But again, with this mix, I wanted something that sounded analog, warm, and natural, and this is the complete opposite of that. The one thing I am impressed with though, listening back, is that if you notice, there's not a lot of hi-hat bleed in the snare drum mic, and I'm not even using a gate on this snare drum. I'm gonna play it again and check that out. The reason why is at this time, I got into the habit of baffling my snare mic to avoid hi-hat bleed. Because as you can hear, it does a great job of reducing those annoying high frequencies that hi-hats generally cause. So not terrible, just way too much processing, way too much EQ. Let's take a look at the toms, which I know are gonna be scary. Much like with my kick drum, for some reason at this time, I hadn't outgrown the whole thing of reducing, or I shouldn't even say reducing, removing mid-range from kicks and toms. And if you look here, I'm using that same notch filter and just completely removing all frequencies between, 300 and 1K. Completely unnecessary, because we have to remember that frequency range is what creates warmth in a sound. It might sound cool to remove it in solo, but then all of a sudden your drums sound spiky, just like a bunch of high frequency and low frequency rumble within a mix, especially once the guitars are placed on top. So these days, yes, I would reduce some of the lower mids, but not by this amount, especially not on a great sounding kit like the one we hear here. I remember specifically recording these drums and being impressed by how great the drums sounded in the room. So for me to go in here and just arbitrarily use these presets just wasn't a smart move, but you live and you learn. And I'm following up that rack tom by some subtle compression, not too bad. And with the floor tom, again, the same thing with removing all of that lower mids, completely unnecessary. and I almost forgot, if you look here, I have that snare submix and I'm compressing these snares even more. Yeah, that's why the snare has that weird, annoying kind of like high frequency sound to it. It's just too much compression. And if you look here, I'm not using any analog saturation or any analog modeling. I'm just using, regular compression and EQ, and that's it. So that's why the drums sound a little harsh. Now I'm gonna skip ahead to bass guitar and let's take a listen to the bass in solo. Okay, so the bass has an interesting sound to it. And I remember when I recorded this, I wanted the bass to be somewhere between Megadeth and The Cure. In other words, I wanted a metal bass tone that had a lot of clank, but I wanted it to sound kind of retro and 80s. That's just the vibe that I felt would fit this song and this production. And I'm actually kind of happy with the bass sound. Yeah, this EQ is not too different from what I would do today. Nothing extreme. I'm using the same SansAmp plugin I still use to this day. A little bit of compression, some basic EQ rolling off all frequencies below 50 hertz and all frequencies above 5K, and a brick wall limiter. And on the bass mid-range here, I'm using a chorus plugin to add chorus. That same SansAmp just with extra gain added. Compression, and I'm band passing this track heavily because this track is meant to be blended in with the original bass tone. Pretty much the same thing I would do today, and a brick wall limiter. Okay, so the bass, not too bad. Now, let's listen to the thing that I'm not too crazy about upon at least first listen, when I first listened to the mix, when I cracked it back open. Let's check out these guitars. Okay, I'm not too crazy about this guitar tone. Now, this track isn't super crazy heavy metal or anything like that. It's got a slight metal vibe to it. I remember when I was recording it, I wanted to go for a more rock kind of sound, and the rig I used was actually a 1x12 cab. I don't remember what cab it was, but I was using the Line 6 Vetted 2 HD head, mic'd with an SM57. Obviously the head was going through that 1x12, and I was miking the 1x12 with an SM57. And as you can hear here, it's just a nasally, boxy, small guitar tone. It could be cool, I guess, as an overdub, but listening back now, it does not stand on its own as the main rhythm guitar sound. Now, if you remember from that last video where I reviewed that mix from 2007, you probably remember the ridiculous EQ settings I had on my guitars back then. Let's look at the EQ I have on these guitars. So apparently in 2010, I learned my lesson and I realized that over EQing your guitars is just not gonna give you a good result most of the time. Apparently I hadn't figured that out with drums yet, but at least I figured it out with bass and guitars. We'll see what I did with vocals, but so far that's what I'm doing with bass and guitars here. So if you look here, I'm rolling off all frequencies below 60 hertz, all frequencies above 12K, and a little bit of notching in the lower mids by a dB, and a little bit of top end removal. And no compression on my guitars at all. Now the first thing I'm gonna do when I remix this song is get rid of this tone completely and reamp the DI tracks. Let's just make sure that these DIs are here. Yes, I got my 2 clean DI tracks that I will reamp through a different guitar tone and hopefully make this mix a little more presentable. Now notice I didn't say I was gonna go in with EQ and fix this guitar tone you just heard, because in my opinion, there is no fixing it. The only way to fix it is to replace it. That's why you should always record DI tracks, at least with your rhythm guitars. Okay, so with that being said, let's move on to our vocal tracks and see what we have.
A little more. You'll not believe in my new disguise. And baby, there's a lot to let it go. I got the weight of a million lies.
Now, like I mentioned earlier, the vocals were really well performed. I remember the singer was using an SM. It wasn't even a 58. It was his SM. I think it was like a 58 knockoff, or at least the cheaper version of a 58, SM48. So the vocals have kind of like a live, raw sound to them because we weren't using a studio mic. He was literally holding the mic. That was the sound we were going for. Where I failed in this mix, like I said, is that I wanted the vocals to sound very colorful and very analog. And to me, they just sound muffled. They don't sound that great in my opinion. The vocals themselves were well performed, but I did not accomplish what I set out to do. And again, I spent over $1,000 on a tube preamp thinking it would give me that analog vocal sound, and it didn't. Now let's look at the processing on the vocals. Not too dissimilar from what I would do now. I have some subtle compression before the EQ. I have some basic EQ on the vocals themselves, rolling off all frequencies below 130 hertz, removing some of the lower mids, some of the upper mids, and a brick wall limiter, and a de-esser. That's it. Now, because the vocalist wanted this track to have kind of like that glass straw vibe, I'm not really using any reverb at all on the vocals, except for some delay on specific words and phrases. Now, I started doing this at this point in my mixing journey because I understood how much impact that adds to a song. Let me just show you what I mean. I'm gonna play the chorus back once more and take a listen to specific words he says. You'll notice a delay trail happening at the ends of very specific words. Let's check it out. Yeah, so as you can see here on this word, I have some delay. On this word here, you could hear it. Now, back in 2007, I wasn't doing this a lot because a lot of the bands I was recording were just, local bands that I couldn't play to a click track. At this stage, I had gotten really serious and would only really record with a click track. These days, I absolutely require all bands to play to click tracks because it makes production so much easier from pre-production, recording, and a mixing standpoint. The only time I won't use a click is if I'm recording a band live where they're all playing together. But if a band wants to not use a click because they didn't prepare, no dice at the studio these days. And I really started that around 2010. And as you can see, it comes in handy. All the parts of the song here are labeled: chorus, pre-chorus, verse 2, so on and so forth. And all of my automation is nice and organized as well. Now, before I move on, I just want to tell you this. Next week, I'll be releasing a 3-part video series where I break down in great detail a remix of this exact song. So in other words, I show you how I would mix the song today and how I would accomplish the task that I mentioned earlier. A nice, warm, natural sounding mix that sounds analog even though I'm mixing completely with plugins. And here's the other cool thing. I'm gonna make these multi-tracks, the exact same tracks that I'm mixing, available to you as a free download. So when I launch the video next week on Monday, if you go into the video's description, you'll be able to download the exact same multi-tracks that I'm mixing. So you can mix them on your own in your own home studio. So be sure to catch Monday's video where I break down my drum mix in extreme detail. You're gonna wanna catch it. So one last time, let's hear the mix that we have here as it was back in 2010 before I remix it next week. Let's check it out. One last thing I forgot to mention is I do have some bus compression happening here, and I had way too much compression, at least in my opinion, for the way I would mix now. I saw around -6 to -8 dB of gain reduction on my master bus, which is a lot. These days, I wouldn't go that crazy. So all in all, that was my not that great mix from 2010. And let me know, what did you think of this mix? Do you personally think that I did a decent job of creating a mix that had an analog vibe, but with a modern edge? In my opinion, I didn't. To me, this mix sounds very cold, very harsh. You hear a lot of high frequencies that are very annoying. The only thing saving this at all, in my opinion, is that the performances were solid, the song was well arranged, and the tracks were recorded very well at the source. What I did with those tracks, in my opinion, wasn't that great, but we're gonna fix that next week. So again, be sure to catch the video series next week. Not only will you learn exactly how I remixed this song, you'll be able to download the exact same files I'm using for absolutely free. If you found this video helpful, like, comment, subscribe, and share. And do not forget to click the little bell icon so you can be notified every time I upload one of my weekly videos on all things metal and rock production. You can both like and follow me on Facebook and Instagram. Links are in the description below. If you'd like to pick up some Frightbox swag, I have a link below to the Frightbox merch store. I've got t-shirts, mugs, and a ton of other cool stuff on the way. Again, the link is below in this video's description. Now, I want you to achieve better results with your mixes with the gear you already have. This is why I've put together my 5-step guide to better heavy mixes. You can download the guide for absolutely free. There's a link below in this video's description. Again, you don't have to buy any new gear to improve upon your craft. You could achieve totally professional results with what you're using. And this free guide will help point you in the right direction. So I will catch you next week for the video series. And until next time, happy mixing.